Hello, welcome everybody to Space Cowboy Books Online. This night we are continuing our exploration into the great science fiction libraries. This evening we'll be interviewing Jeremy Brett, who is the curator of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Research Collection at the Cushing Library at Texas A&M. If anyone from the audience has questions for Jeremy, please don't hesitate to throw them in the chat. I'm also going to drop a link to the Cushing in the chat right now. Jeremy will also be sharing some wonderful links if you are interested in doing some research or exploring the catalog further. So Jeremy, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your job and role at the Cushing Science Fiction Library.
Thanks for having me. So I'm Jeremy Brett, obviously. My official title is I am curator of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Research Collection at Cushing Library. Basically what that means is a curator, I kind of like to say, curator is sort of like an overlord of a collection. What I do and what my colleagues do for their respective collections is we oversee pretty much every aspect of the development of a collection. That includes obtaining of materials, collection development, talking to donors, outreach opportunities such as this, and such as having exhibits, arranging relations with sister institutions about locating and accessioning materials. I process archival materials. That's a fancy way of saying I put everything in boxes and make it available. About the only things that I don't do as curator, I don't actually catalog the materials. That's a specialized library task. We have catalogers for that. And if there's conservation work that needs to be done on materials, which happens, there's a lot of old materials in our collections, we have special staff that actually take care of that, which is good because I can't cut in a straight line, so I should not be trusted with any sort of repair work. The thing would end up worse than when we started.
And how did the Cushing Science Fiction Collection come about, and what did this mean for science fiction studies in an academic setting?
So in the mid-1970s, Cushing had a librarian named Hal Hall. Hal is still around. Hal was a serials librarian, and he himself was a notable science fiction scholar and bibliographer. He created one of the key foundational science fiction bibliographies. He was a scholar and an authority on the Golden Age and the pulp era. And so Hal was serials librarian, so he was looking in the back of a magazine one day. I don't know what magazine it was, and he saw there was an advertisement to purchase a couple hundred science fiction paperbacks. And Hal decided, okay, this was the moment. He decided to seize the opportunity. So what he did was he went to the director of special collections at the time and made a case okay, we should start collecting science fiction. It's becoming more and more of a scholarly endeavor. It's becoming more and more acceptable as a quote unquote acceptable as a form of literature. And he also pointed out that A&M then and now is primarily an engineering school. And he pointed out that engineers love science fiction. Most of the students here became engineers because they read science fiction. They love science fiction because engineers are always the heroes, right? Which is true. How would Star Trek be if Scotty didn't save the Enterprise every week, right? So that's kind of the rationale he was taking. And the director of special collections at the time thought that's a good case. Let's make that case. So from that little embryonic 200 odd paperbacks, that's where the collection started from. And Hal became the first curator. And he was a curator of the collection for, for the first 4 decades of life. And then, and that's got the collection grew from those little 200 paperbacks to the, thousands and thousands of items we have now. And it fits in really well with, especially now, because our English department is actually just established a science fiction studies as a minor. So that took years to do because you have to jump through 8 billion hoops to do this kind of stuff. But that means the English department has a number of scholars in who teach science fiction and fantasy. And so they work with us, kind of a symbiotic relationship. They have this large collection, us, to draw on. And we have this pool of students and interested scholars right here on the campus who become major clients or patrons. So.
Was there any opposition to starting this collection originally? I know that in the academic setting, science fiction traditionally wasn't taken very seriously.
I don't know that much about the dark origins. I do know that back in the day, the English department then was a little the libraries went to the English department too and said, hey, you guys think this is a good idea? The English department at that point, as I understand it, was much more conservative than nowadays. So they kind of like poo-poo the idea, like, no, we don't do that kind of thing. So it took a while to overcome that, but there wasn't any serious opposition that I'm aware of. But once it got through the library's administration, they were the final say. So that's kind of where that came from.
So what led you specifically into the worlds of the science fiction library curation?
It's a very small world. Well, like I think probably a lot of us, it kind of, well, maybe not. Actually kind of happened almost accidentally. I came to Cushing in 2012, and I was hired to be a processing archivist. And that would have included archival material from all different collections at Cushing, so science fiction, but also other collections of Texas history and military and other things we do. And I had come into Cushing from the University of Iowa, where I got a lot of experience working with their science fiction collection, especially their fanzine collections, which are quite large. And I became, one of my mentors here was Kate Coker, who was the science fiction curator then. She and I were friends. We had a lot of the same interests. We're both really into science fiction. And then after about a year, she left, and she said, she told them, Jeremy would be great for this job. Let him do it. So that's kind of how this all happened. So I kind of like stumbled into it, which has been great for me. It's been a fun decade, well, 8 or 9 years doing it. So that's kind of how that happened. Yeah.
And were you very involved in science fiction before taking on the position?
Reading it, yeah. I mean, I wasn't really involved in like on the scholarship level. Like I said, I'd been at the University of Iowa, where I had done work with science fiction archives with fanzines and some of their science fiction collections. So I had a background in science fiction archiving already. So that helped a lot too.
And what are some of the types of research projects that take place at the Cushing, both in the past and currently?
Well, we get a lot of people from the English department who want to use the materials, obviously. We do get scholars, national, international, using the papers and other materials. Some are more, some are more scholarly, let's say, than others. We've had people use, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, we've had people use the George R. Martin collection for scholarly papers because he's becoming more and more of a scholarly interest. But we've had other projects, people using materials for their own for other scholarly work. We get a lot of interesting things too. So for a couple of years ago, we had a class in performance studies, which is kind of our version of an art music theater. And they had a class come in, and one of them was using, we had them look at like all the pulp magazines. And from that, they were supposed to draw dramatic productions. So we had some people, they did like these little one-act plays, some of them based on some of the stories they had read, some based on the graphics, some based on the advertisements. Because especially if you've read those pulp magazines from the 30s and 40s, and you're a kid growing up, and you're a Gen Z kid going to college today, it blows your mind. You see like all the cigarette ads and things like that. So you get all kinds of interesting, weird projects, and we get some stuff that's also fun, even if it's also less scholarly. I remember a year or two ago, when right after Game of Thrones had ended, we had someone come down from the Huffington Post, and they spent an entire week, literally a whole week here, 5 days, looking at. We have one of the pilot scripts for the first episode of Game of Thrones in George R. Martin's collection, and this was an early pilot draft. And what this person did was he went through word by word the pilot script, matched it against what actually occurred in the actual broadcast pilot, and wrote this large scale article about like how scripts change over time and how it's different from how what's written becomes different when it's broadcast. So that was pretty interesting too. So we got all kinds of different things, and we also have people that come in and just want to read because there's stuff here they can't normally get. Which students are allowed to do. We've had students who you can't check out a book. You can reserve it and keep it in our reading room. Nothing leaves the building. But we've had students borrow books, and they've come and sat down for hours at a time and read them, and they come back the next day and read it again, and keep reading until they finished it. So there's all kinds of things you can do with a collection like this. So it's fun.
Do you notice any trends in the research that takes place there? I mean, is that you've been there for almost 10 years now? Have the trends changed as far as the type of research and the type of materials that people express interest in?
I guess I'm seeing these are good questions. I should do some sort of census to sort of like track this. We are getting a lot more, I think, people in the last 5 or 6 years who are using the fan created materials, the fanzines and things, as part of their research, as fan studies in itself are a growing scholarly endeavor. I think we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of interest in writers of, I mean, and this probably isn't much of a change over the last decade, but still noticeable. We get a lot of people interested in works by writers of color, by LGBT writers, by people like that. There's a lot of use of those type of materials too.
And you mentioned the fan materials part of the collection, which we're going to get more into later in the event here, but are there any other specific areas of science fiction that the Cushing attempts to specialize in?
We actually don't. Our mandate is drawn pretty widely. If you ask me, it's like we collect the history and development of science fiction fantasy, which of course is this gigantic subject. So we don't really have a specialty in terms of, we're not focusing on, like, I don't know, new wave or the golden age or the pulps or things like that, or space opera or high fantasy or what have you. We sort of like try and collect as much as we can in as many different genres and subgenres and subject areas and authors as we can. Because I mean, what we're trying to do is try to build as full a chronicle as we can, showing how science fiction fantasy has evolved from the proto science fiction days before Frankenstein all the way to the present and beyond. So it's a large mandate, which probably explains our current space crunch. Perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, we should have tried to specialize. We're late for that now. So we collect pretty much everything. We collect pretty widely.
I get the impression that space is a high commodity in libraries in general.
It is, and I doubt there's any librarian in the country who will say, like, oh, we have so much, unless they just happen to be lucky enough to build a new building. No one will say, like, oh, we have totally all the space we need. Yeah, space is a crunch, because building a library is like building a big box store. You just throw up 4 walls and be done with it. There's a lot of climate issues you have to take into consideration for a library, security issues. There's all kinds of things that have to go into it. So, like, building a library is not easy.
Here's a question from Brian in the audience. What's the oldest object in the collection?
In the science fiction collection, I assume, not the building. That's a good question. And I'm going to put it up, a picture of what we have. So if you will hold on, I will show it to you in a minute. So that's building some suspense.
Excellent. We'll get to that. And do you find, are there any areas of the science fiction collection that are underutilized, places you find people aren't visiting as much anymore for whatever reasons?
I haven't really found that to be the case. Part of it is, a lot of it is, especially since a major part of our clientele are the students who are taking classes in science fiction, fantasy, or literature, or whatever. A lot of it is driven by what they happen to be studying at the time. So there's a lot, for example, a couple of years ago, we had a class on, one of the adjuncts was doing a class on Philip K. Dick. So there was a lot more use of the Philip K. Dick materials. But we have students, people, there are some constants. There's always people wanting Tolkien. There's always people wanting Ursula K. Le Guin, and a lot of the classics. If a class is reading Fahrenheit 451, there's suddenly, like, people want to know about Bradbury. So there's interesting things that get picked up. For instance, one of our classes here, we have a class for religious studies, and well, I guess the pandemic sort of skewed that, but for a while, every year, they would do one of those religious classes. They did a unit on cults, and so what they would do is they would come in, or we would do it by Zoom. They wanted to know about Scientology. So I would bring out a lot of our L. Ron Hubbard material, including, like, the old pulp stories that he had written, to sort of show how, like, okay, here's Scientology, which you guys are hearing about. Here's the science fiction roots of Scientology. And so that's a good way of, that's just kind of another, going back to how people use the collection. That's a good way of, like, taking it in a different direction and giving people an idea of where science fiction appearing in places you might not think it appears, which is always kind of fun.
Sorry, meant to unmute myself there. What are some of the current focuses of the collection's acquisitions, and what directions do you hope or want to take the collection in the future?
Well, we are working very hard to reflect the growing diversity of authors in in science fiction. I mean, science fiction has always had authors of color and women authors and LGBT authors, but we're kind of really seeing sort of like a flowering of them being made available, and of new ones arising all the time. So I'm really trying to keep pace as much as I can with that and acquire materials, books, published materials, and papers when possible of writers of color and more women authors and LGBT authors and people outside the cis white male that we think of as like a typical science fiction writer. So I think it's really important. It's part of, if you're going to document, you need to document the genre as a living thing. And when you do that, that means you kind of, when you have a broad mandate like we have, you have to be able to get as many different kinds of creators as you can. So I'm always on the lookout to try and do that, to acquire books and other materials by as many different kinds of creators as I can, not just the main ones you hear about, but also people from smaller presses and sort of maybe lesser known authors that I happen to hear about or find out about that I think are interesting, and pick those up too. I mean, you talk to any librarian about any kind of collection. I mean, collections are always kind of idiosyncratic because they're always driven by the curator's own interest and curiosity, right? I can't collect everything. I don't have the money. I don't have the space. I don't have the time. So a lot of it is what I think and for other libraries, what they think. What do we think is important? What do we think is interesting? What do we think is would people like? And what would best reflect the genre? So a lot of it is dependent on what I think. And so that's the kind of thing I'm trying. That was a long way to go around that, but that explains why that's part of it, because that's an interest of mine. So trying to show the diversification of the genre is a definitely direction I'm really proceeding.
I might add that another positive trend in the diversification of science fiction is science fiction in translation. Does the collection focus on translated works as well?
Another thing we're trying to grow our collection, our materials from outside the United States and English-speaking countries. It's still a small percentage. I mean, the vast majority of our collection is from the United States, and nearly all of it is, and with the second biggest coming from Great Britain and the Commonwealth countries. But we are trying to grow materials from Asia in particular. But also especially given where we are, we're in Texas, it's the southwest of the United States, where we want to grow Latinx science fiction. So yeah, we are trying to grow outside the sort of English-speaking white bubble. So yeah, but yeah, that's hard. It's hard to collect. Those things are hard, not necessarily as easy to get a hold of, but that is definitely a direction we want to go into.
We have another question here from the audience. This one is from Andrew Lippert, fellow science fiction librarian at the, or rather, archivist processor, if I'm remembering correctly, from the Eaton collection.
Yes.
From Andrew here, greetings from a fellow SF librarian land. Can you give an example of a particularly challenging collaboration with faculty or a class, and one that was particularly rewarding for yourself?
Yeah, well, first to repeat myself, to go back to the one I was talking about, the L. Ron Hubbard one, it's particularly interesting because, like, it's rewarding for me because it brought the science fiction collection to an audience that wouldn't necessarily know about it. It's great having the science fiction specific or fantasy specific classes in here, but of course they're already like, of course we know that collection exists, or like our teacher told us about it. So, and like they're already primed to get that kind of stuff. But when you have a class full of religious studies students who, I mean, may or may not like science fiction in their spare time, but don't really know we have a collection or aren't really made aware of what it can do for them, it's quite rewarding to expose these new audiences to that kind of material. And in the case of L. Ron Hubbard, I mean, we were showing them books, we were showing them pulps, we were showing them old artifacts from back when it was just Dianetics before it became Scientology. There's a lot of great old stuff, if you can find it. Church of Scientology knows kind of puts a clamp on that kind of stuff, but it's fun to get if you can get it. it's challenging. That is particularly challenging because what I wanted to talk to them about was the science fiction roots of Dianetics, right? L. Ron Hubbard got his start as a pulp writer in science fiction and writing westerns and adventure stories. And he developed this really elaborate cosmology for Scientology based heavily on science fiction tropes. And it's interesting how I wanted to and had to strike a balance between explaining this and not wanting to be pejorative about it, right? So the professor and I talked about this very constant, like, don't go into this saying XYZ is crazy, or like how, or do it like a humorous fashion, like, look how silly this is, right? You need to present this. I needed to present this as if it was, because it is, an article of faith among a large group of people. So you kind of finding that balance between stating the facts about this particular cosmology and not letting it slop over into like ridicule or minimization is kind of a tricky thing to do. It's something I hadn't done before, but it was really interesting. I think it had good results. Everybody was really excited about this materials. A lot of people were not aware of that this collection existed. They were not aware of L. Ron Hubbard's rooting in science fiction. So this was a great opportunity to bring the collection to new audiences and show it in a new light. So that's one I like to use as an example.
Is there a good amount of cross-cultural studies involved in the collection in that way? I mean, cross field, where you see, a religion class comes in to look at science fiction. Do you find you get that from other departments as well?
We do some department, yeah. I mean, the most I deal with are probably English, but we also have history classes come in. Like I said before, we've had performance studies. So we've had classes from all over that find it kind of interesting. We've had and not just with classes, we also get like tours coming in to be interested in this kind of stuff. And those, you can sometimes tailor those things to particular audiences. So for example, if you have an audience, so Texas A&M is known for, we start out life as a military school. And we still have the what they call the Corps of Cadets. These are kind of like a local version of ROTC, strictly based in A&M. And there's about 3,000 cadets on campus. And they come to class and they wear the uniforms. But the Corps might send a group over for a tour, and you could tailor things to them. Like you could bring out, they wouldn't just look at the military history material in the military collection, but I could bring out and have done like, here's examples of military science fiction, and show like the military element and how that has played a role in the development of particularly of American science fiction. And they find that stuff interesting too. If you can make science fiction and fantasy touch on someone else's interests, that's always a joy to do that. To make them show like, see, this stuff is kind of relevant to your own interests.
So as a librarian, how do you go about anticipating the needs of future researchers? And how do you go about deciding, I know this isn't any one person's choice, but how do you go about deciding what's relevant in today's science fiction?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not easy. And again, part of this goes back to like collections are kind of fashioned by the curators, like what I think is interesting, what trends I think, and the person who comes after me may go in a totally different direction. It's what interests us. You kind of keep abreast of the scholarly trends. I don't necessarily read like cover every issue cover to cover, things like Foundation and Science Fiction Studies in the major journals, but I keep abreast of like what people are writing about. So that kind of helps. You're like, oh, suddenly there's a lot of stuff about Nnedi Okorafor going on, for example, that or N.K. Jemisin. There's all this stuff being written about them. So you kind of get a feeling where the research is trending. Also, it's a matter of just keeping up with what's being published, what's being critically acclaimed, what's winning awards, what may be flying a little under the radar, but to you, and by to you I mean to me, what looks interesting, what looks like it might be doing something different that hasn't been done before, or might be reinterpreting classic tropes and classic stories, and that so it's kind of a constant mental exercise of trying to keep up with this stuff. So there's a lot of directions to go in. Like I said, you get familiar with a scholarly record, and you do things like you go to conferences and you go to cons and you see what people are talking about, what's what's on everybody's mind, that kind of thing. So it's a multifaceted, multi-pronged process, and it never really ends.
And I forgot to include this when I sent you the questions in advance, but when I was talking to Andrew and Sandy at the Eaton, one of the things that came up was how does the modern librarian adapt to new technologies like the proliferation of e-zines and podcasting in science fiction and fantasy? What are the plans for incorporating these? What difficulties do you face in trying to incorporate non-tangible material into the collection?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something we all deal with. And, I'm an archivist by training. So we were dealing with this before when they started bringing, like, what do you do? Oh, you got all these electronic records. What do you do? It becomes part of the thing is you always need to remember that the important thing is the content, not the medium. So you want to be able to preserve the content as best you can, and you arrange and describe materials and catalog them and make based on the content. Which is to say, you don't treat something differently intellectually because it's like a podcast than say it's like a written book. It's just a matter of how you're going to preserve them. And we're starting to get loads of electronic material, especially from our authors, right? Most authors aren't writing their stuff longhand anymore. Although a lot of them do give me hard copy printouts because a lot of them still work from hard copy when they're editing. But I mean, some of them send their files in Scrivener or in all kinds of other programs. And yeah, as you said, e-zines and podcasts, and these are things where I work closely with my digital archivist and with our digital initiatives people on making sure this stuff is preserved in our dark servers, that it's arranged and described the same way you would describe a written material, so it can be accessed intellectually and can be made available that way. That's kind of I'm not sure I answered the question fully, but it's a question we're all wrestling with. And a lot of it is very common sense stuff. You migrate the media periodically. You make sure nothing is sitting too long on fragile media. If you have like some 50-year-old tape reel, digitize that sucker as soon as you can, because you cannot. That stuff is going to go away very quickly. So we're always conscious. I know Andrew and Sandy are too, and I am. Like, you have the conscious of the fragility of a lot of this media. And it does involve new things that 10 or 15 years ago, none of us would have done. Like, for example, one thing my digital archivist, it's not mine, I don't own him. Our digital archivist does at Cushing. He periodically, at my request, web crawls the websites for the authors who donate materials, because they put material on their website. That's part of the documentation of their career. So that stuff is periodically crawled and saved. And so researchers who want to research the life and career of a particular author will also be able to have access to their social media and their online presence, which is important too. So that's just one of the many things we're all dealing with in the last decade, and it'll probably only get worse as we go forward.
I'm sure those changes will continue to arise.
Oh yeah.
So does the Cushing also focus on fan materials and memorabilia? And if so, can you tell us about this aspect of the collection and how it relates to the bigger picture of science fiction and fantasy in general?
We do. We're collecting that to some extent, but when I got here from Iowa, having been steeped in fanzine culture, particularly media fanzine and fanfic, I really made an effort to start collecting this in huge amounts. So we collect fanzines, we're collecting fan vids, we collect filk, which is another, everyone I assume knows what filk is out there, science fiction folk song, for those people who don't know. So yeah, we're trying to collect all kinds of different fan endeavors. That it's important stuff, because I don't think you can tell the story. You can't tell the story of science fiction fantasy if you're only telling it by, here's the material, here's the stuff people wrote, here's the authors, here's the book or the TV show or the movie. That tells half the story. The other half is the popular reception of it. How is this stuff received by people? And if you're a fan and you encounter something that you love enough to do a zine for it, or to write fanfic, or do a vid, or do whatever, That's important. That's an important phenomenon to document. You know, my collection and Andrew's collection and every other collection, it's full of stories, right? Stories are important to us as human beings. We tell each other stories and we exchange stories because stories mean things to us. They have emotional weight. So the purpose of collecting fan materials is to document that emotional moment where somebody finds something really important to them and wants to keep that story going, wants to reinterpret the story, wants to tell other people about the story they're doing. So that's this stuff is not written or created in a vacuum. It's written for people to experience and to enjoy, and you want to capture that end of it too, or you're only getting part of the story. So, and of course, sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice. Collecting these sort of fan materials is a great way also of getting different voices on record, right? You know, we know starting, of course, we know that fanfic really started booming in the late 60s and 70s with Star Trek in particular. And a lot of that was driven by women who felt Star Trek was speaking to them in a way they wanted to be spoken to. And there was a place for their voices in this particular universe. And so that's where so much fanfic, particularly slash fic, was born and still continues to exist. And so by collecting this stuff, you're collecting these voices of marginalized individuals and underrepresented groups who are seeing themselves or want to see themselves in these stories. So it's a way to get their voices on the record too and make them part of the story.
And why do you think it is that fandom seems to be unique in particular to genre fiction versus, you know, literary fiction or something? I feel like the fandom and science fiction fans as a group, it's so different. Why do you think that is?
Well, let's be fair. There are rabid fan groups like Jane Austen out there, just to name one. So there's literary fiction out there that for people. Yeah, it's a good question. Smarter people, fan scholars and people smarter than me have tackled this, I'm sure. But I mean, I guess part of it is those kind of genres are always, until, you know, the genres were born, you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they were, you know, they were treated as not quite literature, right? I mean, it's from the pulp magazines in the United States that you really start to get things like horror stories and science fiction and horror, you know, and fantasy and mysteries and thrillers and all that kind of stuff. And you know, it was always thought of as like, nah, this is iffy. This is for kids. This isn't like real literature. And I wonder if like how much of fandom was kind of reaction to that, like this defensiveness, like, oh yeah, well we'll show you, right? You know, it may be, you know, maybe it is for kids, but but it's ours, and we like being a part of it. And to find other people who agree with you that something like that is worth reading and something is fun, that means a lot. So that I'm sure there's like a big emotional component to it. Yeah, but yeah, I think you might see more fandom for literary fiction, especially now with online. A lot of where people can find each other more. But like I said, there are like big Jane Austen fans out there. And although I guess it could be considered genre, it could be literary fiction, but the first big fandom was probably Sherlock Holmes. You know, that started while it was still going on. I mean, that was like Arthur Conan Doyle was getting like, you know, attacked in the streets by Sherlock Holmes fans when he killed off Holmes. So I mean, even then you have rabid fans of stories. So it's not a new phenomenon. It's just sort of, you know, it's changed a lot of ways.
I guess I've given away which circles I'm running around in. This one's from Francesca in the audience, and you touched on this briefly, but I am curious, and her question here, authors generally have a strong following online. How are we archiving their social media, online events, websites, and so forth? And moving forward with that question, yeah, how you spoke about how you organize it, but how do you make this available to researchers and students?
I mean, yeah. So things like web crawling that get iterations of websites. You know, their Twitter feeds, things like that. If they do online events like this one, I mean, they're recorded. We get the recordings of those things, or you find them on YouTube and other sorts of channels like that. I mean, they're preserved, like I said, in our dark servers, and they are made accessible in our case through our reading room. We have the files, and we present them to you as we present you a book or any sort of other materials, except the differences would be on the screen. So yeah, it's more and more an issue now, because if you're more and more authors, of course, have this online presence. It's probably harder and harder for any author to get traction these days, unless they have, they may not necessarily have a whole website anymore, but they've got Facebook pages, they've got Twitter feeds, and they've got Instagrams and all that stuff.
So when I spoke with Andrew and Sandy at the Eaton, your name had come up several times in regards to the Consortium of Science Fiction Librarians. And I mean, to me, the Consortium of Science Fiction Librarians, it sounds like a superhero headquarters, frankly, as a book person. So I really love that. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about this group and the work that you do with them.
Yeah, it does. I wish you could. Yeah, I wish you could. We should change our name to like the Avengers, the Justice League, or something cool. But so what this goes back to is, yeah, it's a group of mostly of individuals who work in libraries and archives with science fiction materials. Although we do have members who are just interested in it as or tangentially related to it. So we have people who route materials to us, who find materials for us, or who work in science fiction scholarship, but not, and so it's kind of, there aren't that many of us. You could probably fit all of us across in the whole world. You could find all the people who do the kind of work I do. Probably put us all in my office, or at least maybe we'd spill out the door a little bit. There aren't that many, but because of that, our size is kind of advantaged, because it's easy for us to come together as a group, because we all share the same interests. We all the same, as librarians, archivists, we all the same common problems and common issues with our collections. This was something that I had helped come up with a number of years ago when I was in Iowa, thinking this would be a good idea to, as science fiction librarianship becomes more of a thing, there should be ways for us to collaborate on projects. Like we could collaborate, different institutions could apply for grants together, because grant agencies always love it when like, ooh, multiple institutions, it's always exciting. We can fill in gaps in other people's collections. So if, say, Andrew, and I'm just using him as an example, if Andrew has like, he got this donation and like, hey, you've got like these 50 books that are duplicated in my collection. Here's a list. Any of you guys need them for your collection? Then I or my counterparts at Kansas or or Bowling Green or NIU or any of these other places that collects science fiction systematically can say like, oh, we could use those. And it's a way of building our own collections, but building a relationship amongst ourselves as a discrete group of people with discrete professional interests. So it's fun to do. It's a good way of we're a pretty informal group. We have like a couple meetings online a year. Although one thing I would like to do is for us, once the pandemic dies down and things get back to semi-normal, having like a little sort of a mini conference. We all get together someplace in person at one of our institutions and sort of talk about this stuff in person. So it's fun. It's good to find colleagues who do the same things you do, especially because it's easy in this job, in any job, I guess, to feel kind of alone, to feel like no one knows what I'm going through. I have all this different work and no one else in my institution understands the kind of stuff I'm doing. So one of the purposes of building a consortium was to show people how you're not alone. We have this, we're all in this together. We're all doing the same things. Let us help you out with what we do at our institution. Maybe that can help you.
And here's another one from Francesca. Can you elaborate on how you use the collections to promote diversity, equity, and inclusivity?
One thing we do is, it's got a loaded question. Francesca's our outreach archivist, so she helps me actually do this. One major way we do this kind of stuff is through exhibits. Cushing does a couple of large-scale exhibits a year, and we have smaller scale ones, pop-up ones rotating throughout the year. And those provided good opportunity in recent years for us to showcase a lot of the different diversities in science fiction. In fact, we did one a couple of years ago, which was specifically devoted to that. So we talked about all different kinds, how science fiction isn't just the straight white guy thing you may think of, right? It's always had this very diverse element to it. So we showcase a lot of different kinds of authors. And in doing so, it's a way of showing people that literature doesn't just belong, and science fiction doesn't just belong to one group, it belongs to everyone. Um, there's no one science, this is common literature to everyone. It belongs to all of us. We all have a say in it. We all have a voice to share in it. And so exhibits and events like this, where I can talk about this very kind of thing, are ways of kind of showing how the collection is a diverse group of voices. It's a little, sometimes it's kind of hard to do in a place like this is Texas. There's no surprise to anyone out there that Texas tends to be more of a conservative state, and Texas A&M is more of a conservative institution than say UT. But at the same time, so it can be a little more challenging. People are less likely to believe that we have that kind of diverse materials, or we're that inclusive. But I think it surprises people to find out, I think, not only what science fiction has to offer, but what Texas has to offer with our collections. I mean, one of the other collections in Cushing, for example, we have it's one of the biggest LGBT collections in the state, and it's growing and growing. And within science fiction, we have what I'm pretty sure is the largest collection of slash fiction in print, anyway, in the world, which given Texas A&M's history of not necessarily being welcoming to LGBT individuals, I find to be like constantly hilarious. But it shows there's diversity and equity, inclusivity everywhere you look. You just sometimes need to bring it out. And so we do it with exhibits and events like this.
That's wonderful. And how cool to have the biggest collection of slash. That's a feather in the collection's cap.
I've seen so much slash in my 10 years here, I'll tell you.
So this is always my favorite part of one of these events. What are some of your favorite gems in the collection and why? And please feel free to screen share during this part of the presentation, because I know us fans always love to see these things.
Yeah, I've got a variety of stuff. Unfortunately, they're just screenshots, because my office is not really set up where I can show you the thing itself. So you'll have to bear with me. But let me share the screen here and pull up stuff. Like I was telling you before, I don't have them in any particular order. I'm just gonna go through them and we'll explain them as I go. So somebody had asked about the oldest thing. You can see that? Okay. Somebody had asked the oldest thing we have in the collection. At the moment, the oldest item in the science fiction collection, this is a 1574 edition of the Malleus Maleficarum, which is known as the Hammer of Witches. It's a very infamous book in history. It was created by these two Germans in the late 15th century, and it's basically a witch hunting manual. It explains in great detail, sometimes very nauseating detail, what is a witch? How do you identify a witch? What do you do with a witch when you find her? That kind of thing. It's a horrible. I mean, I've read bits. I haven't read this one because it's in Latin. I read Latin, but it's if you read translations, it's a very misogynistic book, intensely, as you might imagine. And of course, it's in some ways it's a horrible book because it's a book that has actually caused a great deal of suffering over the years. Right, this book led to the deaths of hundreds and thousands of innocent people, mostly women. But a chance came up to purchase it, and I bought it for the collection. I actually share it. It's co-shared between science fiction and our women gender studies collection. But I bought because it kind of vastly expands the concept to me of what fantasy is. Right? What is this book but a handbook on how to catch magical creatures? It's a book that treats magic as if it were a real thing, which they believed at the time. So it's just very interesting, like sort of how what we believe is true and what is fantasy and what is reality have shifted over time. So it may not be strictly a science fiction fantasy work the way we understand them today, but but I wanted to keep it for that reason because it is essentially fantasy, right? It's all complete nonsense. It's fatal nonsense. It had a horrible impact on people, but still, it's a version of fantasy in its own right, and it kind of shows that what people it's a key document for understanding witches, which of course witches are obviously an ongoing trope in fantasy, and in science fiction with places people like the Bene Gesserit and Dune are kind of, future witches. So that's kind of why I have the Malleus for the collection, because of that. I wanted sort of more expansive, this expansive idea of fantasy. Move on and find a different thing here. Sorry, this will do a clumsy. Like I said, I'm just sort of pulling this stuff off. All right, can you see this? Can you see the bust in this picture now?
No, it's not popping up yet.
Okay, all right, hold on, let me try this again. This is all right, let's go with this. Let's go with this in a different way. Okay, so you see this. This copy of Dracula, you see it coming up? Okay, this is actually interesting. This is a paperback copy of Dracula from 1901. So the novel Dracula came out in 1897. But in 1901, Bram Stoker produced, and it's published by the same company, Archibald Constable, a paperback version that's abbreviated. He made judicious cuts in places, and because he wanted it's made more accessible, it's cheaper. It's about, this is the kind of book you could buy at the W.H. Smith was a thing then. You could buy it at the train station, read it on the train. It's a much more. It was kind of a way to bring Dracula to a larger audience using the new paperback format, which then, as paperback. Of course, the real paperback era started in the 50s and 60s, but back in 1901, it was still thought it was like a little iffy as far as literature goes. But it's a particularly important document because there on the cover there, that's an image of Dracula. Those of you who read the book remember at the beginning, the whole first part of Jonathan Harker going to his castle in Pennsylvania. So here's a picture of Dracula, and he looks out the window at one point, and he sees Dracula descending the walls of the castle, with a bat. And that is the picture of Dracula. That's actually the first illustration of Count Dracula anywhere. Was in this 1901 paperback edition of Dracula. So it's kind of an important document for that reason. I apologize, this is more blurry than I meant it to be. These are from the papers. These are from Michael Moorcock's papers. You can see, jump up. If you can't see them, just shout at me. But I'll just assume you're seeing things unless I hear different. So among our papers, among our archival collections, we have papers belonging to Michael Moorcock, which may seem weird given where we are, but in fact, Michael Moorcock, I thought it was weird when I came here, but Michael Moorcock actually lives part of the year in a small town outside Austin, not too far from here. So we have a lot of his papers. This is an unpublished story called What the Public Wants, and he wrote it around 1959. And what's particularly interesting about this is Michael had added notes to this story explaining the basis for it. So this story written about 1959 was never published. It was based on my dissatisfaction with Fleetway Publications, for whom I was by this time working. Didactic and dull, perfect example of righteous passion producing rotten fiction. So it's funny, like Michael dunking on his own work. The guy knows when he's writing something weak. Those of you who have ever met Michael or read any of his stuff, Michael has opinions on things, and not least of which is his own work. So these kind of archival materials like this are a lot of fun because you really get a sense of, you really hear the author's voice. Like literally, this is what the author himself thought about what he was doing. So these are kind of fun things to have too. And if you went down, you'd see their edits and like text block out and things like that. So, but that's kind of a fun one. Let's see. This is a good one. So this is a book a lot of you may have seen before. This is a very famous book in weird fiction. This is 1939's The Outsider and Others by H.P. Lovecraft, but published by Arkham House. This one's fun to show just because, obviously it's a pivotal book, right? Very important. This is a collection of Lovecraft's Big Stones. But I like to tell the story about this because it's a good example of how the weird ways and things come to libraries, how collections are built. So we've had this about 4 or 5 years. A colleague of mine over at our main library came to me with this book one day. He said, a friend of mine who he would not name, who wanted to remain anonymous, wants us to have this book. All right, awesome. We already have a copy of it. We don't have it with a dust jacket, which makes it very cool. And he said that, here's what happened. This friend of his, back in the 70s, before we had a library collection, was at our main library and found this book on the shelf. Now he knew, even then, this is a really important book, really significant. It's in great shape, by the way. You can't necessarily tell from this picture. So what he did was he checked it out, and he went over to Cushing Library, which was special collections then, but did have a science fiction collection. And he said, hey, this is a really important book in the history of science fiction. H.P. Lovecraft, big name author. The stories here are really important. I think you guys should have this book. It shouldn't just be sitting on the shelf at Evans, which is our main library, where it'll get lost or beaten up or whatever. And the administration of Cushing at that time was not really pro science fiction. They said, yeah, no, that's not really what we want. It's not really a thing for us. So we don't want it. So the guy said, okay, we took it home, lost the book, paid the fine, which at that point it was like $2. Evans did not replace it. So he had this friend, this guy who I do not know his name, had this book sitting around his house for about 40 years until finally, I guess he had a pang of conscience and had our mutual friend bring it back and said, okay, I think now Cushing could have this book back. You guys have the science fiction collection, take the book back, and now it has a home. It's like, awesome. So that's kind of an example of how weird stuff sometimes comes to a collection. It's kind of funny.
That's almost a Lovecraftian plot of this traveling book.
Kind of, right? And this is the spot, the text block, and you see that little scratched out area. That was the stamp that said belonged to Texas A&M University Libraries. The guy who had this book very, very carefully etched off the stamp. There, I don't like how long that took, but he etched it out and it's like the book is still in like amazing shape. But he etched it out to like hide the evidence that it belonged to A&M. So clearly he was in it for the long term. That's sort of a funny little thing. What else do I have? So this is a fun one. So this is a page from a book from 1638 by a guy named John Wilkins. So John Wilkins was a fellow of the Royal Society. So he hung around with the England's early modern scientists. He was an English cleric. He's one of the only guy. He managed to survive the English Civil War because he was an Anglican minister. So you think that would have gotten him thrown out of, or definitely dropped out of the social hierarchy during Cromwell's period. But he had some relationship to Cromwell. He was like married to Cromwell's niece or something like that. So he managed to smuggle through. This is a book he wrote. This is from a book he wrote in 1638 about the moon. So it was a scientific / theological tract. It was all about like, okay, basically his theory was, I can explain scientifically and theologically why there's probably life on the moon. Obviously, it's pre-Newton. He got a lot of the science wrong, but the fact is, it's still a really neat book. And this little section here, you notice he says, I do seriously and upon good grounds affirm it possible to make a flying chariot in which a man may fit and give such a motion unto it, I shall convey him through the air, and this shall perhaps might be made large enough to carry diverse men at the same time, together with food, for viaticum, and commodities for traffic. This is an important passage because this is the first account in early front. This is the first really account we have of a spaceship. Now, obviously, early writers of mythology and writers had talked about going to the moon. They talked about like, I'll fly to the moon on a giant bird, right? It's part of a myth or something, or I'll be carried to the moon by a god or something like that. This is the first account we have of somebody describing, let's build a machine. We have to build a machine that would take us to the moon. Now, his machine would not have worked, except for one thing that was based on the idea that the bird, it would flap wings. In Wilkins' day, he thought that basically his theory was, so he thought there was a magnetic field around the Earth, which of course there is. He thought about 200 miles out, that field would go away, and then you just like fly to the moon with no problem, which of course is completely wrong. But still, this is an example of kind of a sort of quasi example of science fiction. I mean, it's science of its day. Of course, it is science fiction because it's impossible. But it's kind of rooted in scientific principles such as they are. So it's a really important book for that reason. So that's one we like to keep around. I'll just do a couple more because I know time is short. This is one that's particularly important to me. This is the manuscript for the book Don't Bite the Sun by Tanith Lee. So Tanith, this was Tanith's first book. Not her first published book, but this was the first book she wrote. And this is old school, right? She wrote this, you can see this on tattered, like school grade notebook paper. And she wrote it longhand. Or her mother, actually, her mother wrote part of it too, wrote part of the stuff for her as she dictated. What I find really interesting about this is for several reasons. One is, I mean, as an archivist, this kind of stuff is gold, right? Ah, it's paper. It's awesome. I can touch it. It's so cool. But also, Tanith Lee is actually very important to me because Tanith was the first adult fantasy writer that I ever read. And her work means a lot to me. It's her, you know, she's a beautiful writer. If none of you, if people out there have not read her, you should. She writes very lush, very dark. She writes fantasy and science fiction and horror. And what's really interesting, I made email contact with Tanith a couple years, about a year after while I was in this job, about a year or so before she died. And she donated this to me, but you'll notice below what she says, that stuff written in black ink, that, and when it says missing first couple pages, the rest of that is stuff written to me personally. She put it on the manuscript to give me some descriptive information about the object, which is, you know, kind of the same way that Michael Moorcock wrote in his. She's writing this sort of context for researchers, but since she wrote it for me, I found that particularly sweet and compelling, and it meant a lot to me. So when people ask me what my favorite thing in the collection is, this is usually what I point to because it has kind of that personal element. We're almost at the end. Let's see if I can find one or two more that are kind of cool. I don't want to take up too much of anyone's time. Oh, this is a fun one. So this is the first issue of Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey. Oop, hold on. Okay, you can see that. Okay, notice the particular inscription Anne wrote. What I am told is, because we have the information from the guy who sent this. So this guy named Dick, I can't remember his last name is, he went and bought this book at a used bookstore back in the day. I think it cost him like 25 bucks. Later on, he went to a signing and he met Anne McCaffrey and he presented this first issue of Dragonflight. And she was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. My first book, this is cool. Where'd you get it? He explained, well, I went to a bookstore, I found it, and I paid 25 bucks for it. And he said, but I went later and looked up what it was worth. And at that point, and it was worth like $5,000 or $10,000. And he told her that, and she said, fuck. So that's what she wrote to him. That's my favorite inscription ever. It's another way of like showing like these authors are people, right? They aren't just like sitting on the mountaintop writing books and delivering them to people. They were people, and they thought the same. They thought, they swore, and they sounded. They're people like us. Anne McCaffrey is particularly important also because one of the sub collections we have here, we have Anne's own science fiction fantasy books that she owned. Her son Todd donated them to us a few years ago, and they all have her little ex libris that she stamped, and it says, it's got a dragon, because it's Anne McCaffrey. So it's kind of cool. So that's the example. I mean, I don't want to. Yeah. So those are just kind of random examples of different things we have in the collection. I think are kind of interesting. That's obviously a very small portion. There's a lot more to do, but those are just some examples.
Thank you so much for sharing all those treasures. You touched on it briefly, but I'm very curious about how Michael Moorcock's papers, the British New Wave writer, ends up in Texas. Can you elaborate on how this found its way to the Cushing more?
Yeah, this predates me. So a lot of Michael's materials up until I want to say like the mid 90s are at the Bodleian in Oxford. But there was some sort of, and I don't know all the details, but like I said, this predates me, some sort of disagreement with how Oxford was doing with his paper. So when he was here, living here with his wife, Linda, and Hal, who was our curator then, made contact with him. This was about 2002, and said, started making a deal with him, like, you've got these papers now, we've got the science fiction collection, we can take care of them. And so a lot of back and forth went to work this out, but that is why Hal made this negotiation with Michael and Linda, and that is why so many of Michael's papers, more recent papers, are here with us at Cushing, rather than being at Oxford. You would think, and you're right. I thought it was weird too. Like Michael's like the new wave guy, the British wave guy. Why is this stuff here? Why is he even here? I don't know. People end up in weird places in life, but that's kind of how it happened. And it goes to show how libraries often collect stuff that's not necessarily, institutions collect stuff from people who aren't necessarily that connected to them. Formally, it's just not necessarily random chance, but these sort of informal connections, right? The biggest archival collection we have is George R. R. Martin's papers. Moorcock runs a second, and as I'm always telling people, always asking, why are George R. R. Martin's papers here? It's like he didn't go to A&M. He went to Northwestern. He's not from here. He's from New Jersey. Which, if you hear him talk for 1 minute, you will know he's from New Jersey, right? He doesn't live here. He's lived in New Mexico for like 40 years. But he used to come here in the 80s for AggieCon, which was a convention run every year by Stephanie Variable, the student science fiction group on campus. And Martin came, and he was in the 1986 con. He was here. That was an important con, by the way, because it was run by Aggie Senior and Martha Wells, who everyone in the world knows Martha now because of the Murderbot Diaries, and we have Martha's papers here too. So Martin came, and some people from Cushing came to him and said, "Hey, he hadn't written Song of Ice and Fire yet, right? He was known for science fiction mostly." And they said, "Hey, you're a well-known writer. You got these papers. You like A&M. You come here a lot. You like Texas. You thought what do you want to do with your paper someday?" And he hadn't. So he gave it some thought. And in the mid-90s, he came back to us and said, let's do this. So, since the mid-90s, Martin's been giving us his papers ever since. And not because he has a formal connection to A&M, but just because the personal relationships that he developed with people here and with direct inquiry from our director. So how things come to a library, all kinds of angles.
And that ties in perfectly to my next question here. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the author's papers area of the collection. You showed some highlights there. How does an author go about donating their materials to the collection? And what does the process look like for papers to become part of the collection? And then I'm going to tack on another question from Andrew in the audience here. Any other weird or amusing stories of unusual acquisitions or donations?
That was a good question. Also, I put in the chat, and I know Andrew and Sandy did this last time, but I figured I'll put it again. So for people who weren't there, we'll have it. Because we're mentioning authors' papers. This is a link to something that the Consortium has created. It's a directory. It's a wiki of places where it's arranged by author and where their papers reside. So for people who want to go do research for particular authors, they can use this to find out what libraries those are. But authors' papers, we can acquire them in all sorts of different ways. There are cases where we contact the author. So like they did with Martin, or like Hal did with Michael Moorcock, or like I have done with several authors, that the authors that I will reach out to them proactively and talk to them about the collection. So like, have you thought about what you want to do with your archives? And 9 times out of 10, they have not given it a single thought. Particularly, I like to reach out to, and I know my colleagues like to do this too. If you want to also, what's fun to do to try and find authors who are kind of new in their careers, so put the idea in their head about saving materials, and sort of like, kind of get in their heads from the beginning. So you can contact them directly, ask them. I have had authors contact me, and I'm sure Andrew and Sandy and all my colleagues have the same, like, hey, I hear you have this science fiction cancer research collection. Would you be interested in my papers? And so we've had cases like that. We've had cases where authors have referred other authors to us. So we've had authors who say like, oh yeah, hey, I've got this, hey, we have this author's papers. And they will say like, oh, I have a friend who is also an author and they've written such and such and such and such. You've probably heard of them. They're looking for an archives too. And so we talk to them. So the author's papers can come from all kinds of different ways. Or in Tanith's case, this came to us because we are the repository. Tanith has a bibliographer in Rhode Island who is Daughter of the Night is the name of the website. And Allison is the librarian there who does the bibliography. It's like a very thorough bibliography of Tanith's works. And so when Allison was finished with the book, she sends them to us. So we're kind of the big repository for Tanith's works. And that's how Tanith got to know about us. And that's how this all started. So there's all kinds of ways, but the process, once it's arranged, is kind of the same. The authors send us materials, physical, digital, however they want to do it, as they see fit, and they are sent what we call a deed of gift, and they sign it. The deed of gift is the fancy term for officially transferring ownership of the materials from them to us, and then the material becomes the public property. And I like to stress to the authors, we're a public university. this material is public property, so you're not going to just throw it away or get rid of it or sell it. We can't do that. It's ethically, we won't do that. We can't do that if we wanted to. There are laws for that kind of thing. So we try to lead them through the process, making it clear, because a lot of them aren't familiar with how the archiving process works or what will happen to their materials. We explain to them how things will be arranged and described, how things will be made accessible, make them conscious of like their rights as far as copyright go and things like that.
And for those that can't visit the Cushing in person, I know you did share a link a second ago here, but what online resources are available for both researchers and the public? And can they request materials from you directly?
They can actually. You've got the Cushing. I'm gonna throw a couple more URLs here. But you threw up the link to the library itself, and you can contact us. I'm gonna put up the link to the library catalog. Everything, all the published materials in Cushing, including science fiction materials, are available in the catalog. You can look them up. If you need material, we're a special collection, so material does not leave here. You can't check out a book. We're not going to send you the book. We're not going to send you Pamphlet's manuscript, but we can send you scans of portions of books, specific materials you're looking for. That's arranged through our public services team, through our reading room. So you would contact them, and they would, they'll make you fill out the paperwork, and then so material can be acquired by you online. We've always done that. It's especially important now because of the pandemic. We get fewer people who are actually here, and of course, we're halfway between Austin and Houston, so we're not like out in the boonies, but still, we're not exactly on the beaten path for a lot of people. So not everybody can like come down here to use the material. So we can make things available to you through scanning. There are some materials online. Most of what we have, hold on, sorry, I'm putting together my my various links here. So throwing up a link to the catalog. I'm throwing up a link to the finding aids. Finding aids are the descriptive apparatus for the archival collection. So basically, it's the fancy term for the list of what is in the boxes. So if you want to look up like what's in the Michael Moorcock collection or George R. R. Martin or whatever, you can find it through there. And then if you wanted something, so if you find, I don't know, you look at the George R. R. Martin collection, like, oh, here's that first draft of Game of Thrones. Man, I'd really like to have the first chapter of that. I'm like, okay, we'll scan it and send it to you. So that can be done too. We don't, as far as materials online go, one thing hold on, sorry, I'm trying to type and talk at the same time. One thing we do have, we have a growing collection of our fanzines are available online for you to look at, and I'm going to put that up. That leads you to the Sandy Herald collection, which is our growing online collection of media fanzines, which is a lot of fun. I think it's a good idea of a lot of the fanfic that we have. We don't have a concerted program to make digital items, public domain digital items online. That require a lot more staff than we have. But it's something I think we should start doing in the future. Things that are in the public domain that we don't have to worry about someone suing us, we could start putting up. So yeah, what we have online now is fairly limited as far as we go, but I think that's going to grow.
And if someone from the public wants to donate either materials or funds to the Cushing, how does one go about it? Do you take books from the public, special items and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, I can't guarantee we take it because it would depend on if we already have it in the collection. But we are open. I'm certainly speaking for me. I can't speak for all my colleagues. But yeah, we do take donations of pretty much any kind. You can contact me. My email address I put at the top of the chat. If you have something you're interested in donate, or if you have monetary gifts you want to donate, I'm not going to say no to money. They're more hoops we have you jump through for that because there are things you have to fill out. But yeah, books, and all the time I frequently get members of the public saying, oh, I have this collection of books or fanzines or photographs or magazines or whatnot. So yeah, we taking stuff all the time. And most of the collection, I don't have a fraction, but it's at least 80% of the collection is donations. I mean, I have a collection budget, but I can't buy everything out there that I want to. So we depend heavily on donations.
Well, this is going to conclude the interview. Thank you so much, Jeremy Brett, curator of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Research Collection at the Cushing Library at Texas A&M. It's been illuminating and wonderful to find out about these things as we continue our exploration into the great science fiction libraries of the United States and hopefully the world as we move forward. Jeremy, I'd just like to give you this moment to have any parting statements or anything that you'd like to say you didn't get a chance to.
Just thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I hope the people out there are finding it interesting and finding me comprehensible. I can't always tell on this end if I make sense. Like I said, I am always available to answer questions. If people have them online, you can email me, and as I said, 99% of materials in the building are available to the public for you to access. Almost everything you find in the catalog, you will be able to get access to if you want. I guess I just want to conclude by just noting that I talked a little bit in the beginning. I talked about the point of stories, and what I find really rewarding about this job, I'm sure Andrew and Sandy and all my colleagues also will give you different answers. But what's really important, these kind of collections I think are important. It's not just, we're not just preserving science fiction because it's cool, which it is. I think so. If I didn't, this would be a very, very hard job to do. But like I said before, stories are kind of one of the things that make us human. We tell each other stories, and stories mean something to us. And what I like to think of this collection that I have is everything in it, from the greats, from Le Guin and Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury and Octavia Butler and all the big names, to the pulpiest pulp story in the world, to the John Norman Gore series from the 70s that was so terrible, to those 80s those 80s novels that took place in a post-apocalyptic United States, and there always seemed to be like an ex-Green Beret who was like fighting off mutants and Soviet soldiers at the same time, right? All those, man, there were a lot of those. Every one of those stories meant something to somebody at the time. Right? There's no story in my collection or Andrew's collection, anything that went unread by somebody. And I think that meant something. Those stories meant, sometimes it meant something big. Sometimes it was inspired people. A story may have inspired someone to write. It might have inspired them to think about things in a new way. It might have inspired them to become a scientist or an engineer, or to think about new ways of doing things. Sometimes it may have just like killed an hour out of their lives. And like that's, all that is valuable and all that's important. So I think these collections of ours are important, not just because there's neat stuff in them, but because they preserve the importance to us as humans of storytelling. And I think that's a really important reason for having this kind of stuff made available. So we'll always have those stories, because stories get told and get retold. New generations will find them. And again, every story has meant something to someone who read it, and it may again. So that's one of the main reasons we have these collections.
Thank you so much for saying that. I think fiction is the emotional history of humankind, and it's just as important. That's a good way to put it, yeah. It's just as important as our factual history. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jeremy Brett. Thank you so much to our audience for your wonderful questions. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I can't wait to come visit the Cushing as well.
Oh yeah, come anytime. We're a public university. Last thing I should mention, we're a public university, so we are open to everyone. We don't make you jump through hoops to get in here to use stuff. You want to use stuff, we're not going to ask you why. We're not going to justify why you're here. Just come and use our stuff.
Wonderful. Get down there, everybody. Thank you to our audience. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Bye.